Welcome to G.L.O.W, Gorgeous Ladies of Podcasting.
I'm here too.
Engage.
This is, excuse me, a damn fine cup of coffee.
I am the one who knocks.
Hi, I'm Jessica K. Richards, and I study television.
I'm Ashley Zanter, and I'm an academic who does cultural studies.
And I'm Scott Nielsen, and I also once auditioned with a headshot of a wolf.
And this is UniversiTV, a podcast where we discuss television that's in its first season and sometimes do retrospectives, so keep a lookout for those. Today we're discussing G.L.O.W, the Netflix original series, which stands for Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling, which is a fictionalized origin story for the actual 80s Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling. And so we're going to be talking about that today, guys. So what are your opinions on G.L.O.W?
I thought it was all right.
Starting out strong.
No, I think it's an interesting show. I think that there are some compelling characters in it. And I actually really enjoyed, there's some really great beats and moments in the show that, as a viewer, were very optimistic and deeply satisfying. But on the whole, I didn't really feel like it was doing anything incredibly innovative. And I thought that, with the exception of, Allison Brie, who plays the main character in the show, that a lot of the performances were just they were all right, and not super memorable for me, I think, was kind of how I felt about it.
It's interesting that you feel that way, because I feel that Allison Brie, while playing Ruth was an amazing performance, I think that Mark Maron playing Sam Sylvia, the director of G.L.O.W, was great. He was funny, he was scathing, he tied the whole thing together, drove it. He was probably my favorite part of the show entirely. So I think it's selling the show a little bit short to say that Allison Brie is the only good performance.
Well, and I guess that's part of it for me, was that Mark Maron's character as the director, he kind of problematized the feminism of the show for me. Just how callous he was. I thought he was very funny. I laughed out loud at a lot of his lines, but then I felt bad immediately afterwards, right? And that was kind of the point of the humor in G.L.O.W, was that there was a lot of extremity to the kinds of jokes that they were making, and a lot of them were, deeply uncomfortable. There's that whole miscarriage sequence that's supposed to be one of the stories that they're telling as a wrestling match. And I found that, really uncomfortable.
But isn't that the point, that when we have problematic things in the show that kind of undercut the feminism, that it sort of highlights how cool this is important and this is why feminism is important. For example, the very first scene of the entire show is Ruth reading the man's part, auditioning, and they're like, "You're reading the man's part, read the secretary." And it's to highlight that specific thing that you're talking about. So I think that the problematic things you're talking about actually highlight the feminism of the show.
Well, and I guess that was kind of where the line was for me in a lot of ways. I felt like I couldn't tell. Because you're right, that opening sequence where she has that really interesting, compelling monologue, and then we find out that she's reading the man's part. And in fact, the overt objectification of these women throughout the series seems to be clearly commenting on, how it feels to live in a world where you're completely subjugated, and how you kind of just have to deal with the dregs of what's left over as you're trying to find a part or find your place in the world. But I also felt like that there were some things that were so funny that they sort of undercut that message by, the fact that he's a charming, I have air quotes up, because it was so weird. He's such an interesting character in that way for me, because half the time I loved him and the other half of the time I hated the words that were coming out of his mouth.
Are we still talking about Mark Maron?
Yes, still talking about Mark Maron's character. Sorry.
What do you think, Ashley? Because obviously Jess and I are divided. I'd like a tiebreaker.
Okay. Well, I actually really appreciated the show's feminism. And in an earlier episode, when I mentioned that I was watching this, I thought that it was better feminism than the Wonder Woman movie that just came out. And the reason why I felt that way is because, there are multiple female characters in the show, all of which are pretty interesting and multifaceted. I think that the show is deeply character-driven, and that what I found particularly interesting and a good case for the feminism was there's a presence of three men, right? So you've got Mark Maron's Sam Sylvia character, you've got Bash, who's the financier of these women and their goal to do this, and then you've got Betty Gilpin, who plays Debbie Egan, her husband, and they're estranged, and he's kind of a douchebag, and he's sleeping with her best friend, and like that sort of. And so I think that how interesting and engaging and compelling the female characters are is highlighted by how uninteresting the male characters are.
Well, and I guess for me, maybe the problem that I had with it was that I didn't really feel like that any of the characters in and of themselves were particularly innovative, because it almost felt exactly like watching an episode of Orange is the New Black for me in a lot of ways. Like the characterization of these women kind of fell into that spectrum where it was like, we're not good guys, we're not bad guys, we're just sort of we occupy a sort of a neutral space, and we're trying to talk about how various systems oppress us. And so the characters like that you're talking about, these male characters that we have, like Bash, that are kind of horrific examples of masculinity within this world, really reminded me of characters like Pornstash from Orange is the New Black, who just kind of walks around and dominates that space and makes a lot of unfortunate comments about women and their relationships.
Well, and I think it's worth knowing that Genji Kohan is a producer on both of those shows.
Exactly, right.
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to push back a little bit on the criticism that it's not innovative. And not that I'm saying it is innovative, but just that I don't think that's a fair criticism. I think you could say that being innovative enhances the quality, but I don't think it's a detraction if you're not. I think it tells a good story. It's about the different forms of oppression for women. We have Sam Sylvia, Mark Maron's character, who oppresses them and the things he makes them do and the ways he bends them to his will. We have the financier, Bash, who is saying, you must be a stereotype, who he decharacterizes them. And then we have Mark, Debbie's husband, who says, you cannot, your obligation is to this marriage, who is holding her to this gender role, and that she's trying to, and it's about how these women, A, break out of it and how they bond. And I think, A, you could say that's not innovative, but I also think it's just valuable and important, and it's fun, and it's funny. And I think a show doesn't have to break the mold to be quality.
Well, and so for me, I guess when I'm talking about innovation is that this was just a really long sports movie. Right? Like that's essentially the problem with the show. And in fact, it even has several long sports montages of various training activities, right?
Set to 80s music.
And so I feel like and in fact, it upholds the generic conventions of that kind of film to the extent that I didn't find anything that was happening in the show to be very surprising or exciting. Not like I am all about sports movies, I like Cool Runnings, Remember the Titans. I can weep with the best of them in those, moments. But I didn't feel like G.L.O.W. tried to earn those moments, and there were a couple of them that were really exciting. But I felt like overall it wasn't a series that I think is going to be very memorable for very long, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. But one of the ways that I think it is innovative and ascends above a typical sports movie is that the whole show revolves around Ruth and Debbie's relationship and how that interacts with the different male structures of power present in the show. We have Mark, Debbie's husband, who Ruth sleeps with, causing the inciting incident of, cool, now we hate each other, or Debbie hates Ruth and Ruth feels awful, and that breaks their friendship. But then you have Sam Sylvia directing the show, where they're both vying for his approval and trying to become the star of the show. And it's interesting because in a typical sports movie, you would have a romantic interest that Ruth really connects with and wants to fall in love with, and they get together and have the big kiss at the end of the big game that they have. But instead, we have the series end with Ruth and Debbie coming together for this common goal. But then their relationship's not magically fixed, like it would be in a sports movie. Their relationship is still, hey, I need some time.
Well, and then I particularly liked that, when you have a show like The Handmaid's Tale where you're following June around and you sympathize with her, you want good things for her, you want the things that she wants for herself. This is not necessarily how I felt about Glow. We have these two female protagonists. We've got Ruth, played by Alison Brie. We've got Debbie Egan, played by Betty Gilpin. But I don't know that I necessarily really sympathized with either of them, right? Because from the outset, we're shown that Ruth is a problematic person, right? She's knowingly sleeping with her best friend's husband. She's I don't know that I would classify her as a good person. I don't know that I would classify her as a bad person, but she makes really stupid decisions and self-destructive decisions. And so a lot of times when bad stuff happens to her, I'm like, well, you saw the other path, but then, I'm also not necessarily rooting for Debbie to get what she wants. I mean, I was really thrilled when currently married Debbie slept with really sexy wrestler guy in the back dressing room. That was really satisfying for me. Should she have done that? No, because that's technically adultery. But I just was like, that's an amazing character decision for her at this point in time in the show. And so there weren't necessarily trajectories that I was predicting. I think they made really interesting, authentic decisions that I sometimes agreed with and sometimes disagreed with. And for me, I think that was really satisfying as a viewer.
I will say that I do think that this show does unlikable in probably the best way. So many times with feminism and with different shows that women are not given the space to be unlikable as a result. And like movies and stuff like that have been reshot based on one female protagonist not being able to be likable enough for everybody in the audience to go, oh, she's so cute. And so I thought, like, there have been shows, again, I would say Orange is the New Black, Piper Kerman, the main protagonist in that particular show, is really unlikable. But she's not a character that you love to hate. She's just irritating. Yeah. And in this show, I could tell, I felt that Alison Brie's character was unlikable, but she also, there was a lot of pathos there, too, right? Like, I really emoted with her, and I felt some of the things that she was feeling. And so it was like, even though the Russian accent went on a little too long, I did feel like I cared about her. Right. So I did think that was an interesting balance that they were able to strike. Like her monologue at the party where she's talking about how valuable wrestling has been to her. Like that was a really powerful moment in the show. So I think that there are some things that it does well. One of the problems that I kind of had with it a little bit is it's trying so hard to be like, we're 80s. Look at us. We're in the 80s, But
that was so much of its charm.
So it was, but like there were parts of it that I felt like sort of dragged on a little long. Like, for example, the let's have the crazy home pregnancy test sequence. And like, there was a part of me that was like, this is interesting insight into what it was like to be a woman in the 80s. But at the same time, there was a part of me that was like, okay, we get it. It's different now than it used to be,
Yeah. Well, and I think the show, and I agree with you, the kitschy 80s, it was a lot. Scrunchies and crimped hair and metallic spandex. We start to get it after a while. The terrible white Miami Vice blazers rolled up to the elbows. But I think that in terms of having that conversation about what it was like to be a woman in the 80s, the show does some really fascinating things with like, what does it mean to be feminine when we're having that conversation, right? So you've got Sheila the she-wolf, who I thought was particularly interesting. She dresses like a wolf and it's supposed to be her wrestling persona, but it's not her wrestling persona. It's who she is as a person. And she has that amazing speech where she's talking to Ruth and she's just like, I don't dress like this for you. I dress like this for me. And it's an identity conversation. And then the entire sequence of Ruth choosing to have the abortion. I thought that was extremely engaging and compelling as a viewer. And I don't know that I've seen something quite like that on television.
Well, and I feel like so often the way that they film abortion, they're like, they know they're doing something dangerous. The network always approaches it and is like, here we go, we're doing the plot line. And this for me felt like it was just very casual in the way that it approached it. And I actually appreciated that treatment of it rather than it being this, this softly playing music as the camera pans above her, kind of a thing that they
the
showed.
Olivia Pope in Scandal treatment.
Scandal treatment rather than, and I liked how dry it was and how, like, they didn't add in any music into the background of those moments where they're asking her questions and they're being invasive. I thought that was a really interesting an interesting handling. But again, you know, it was one of those situations where I was sitting there going like the dialogue in the preceding scene was so uncomfortable that Sam, who's her director, is trying to bail her out in front of the nurse and like trying to make her feel better about the fact that she's about to have an abortion and make this decision. And he goes there and then he crosses the line and you can see it all happening and you can see her like being like, yeah, thanks, you know, and it's so awkward that I don't really know where to land with that kind of experience.
Yeah, but they play that off so well
Yeah.
because they end it with a joke. And that's the great thing, is that they don't build abortion up to be this helter-skelter boogeyman. It's awkward, it's uncomfortable, and we can make jokes about it because people often do. And I thought that's brave, but that also doesn't cause too much of a tonal inconsistency because it's a pretty silly show. And that's the heaviest moment. So throwing in that perfect joke was just like, this is a great show. That was the moment I said, this is a great show.
Well, and Sam is such a consistent character a lot of the time. He sort of ends the show how he starts the show. He's a crass, kind of, you know, under the bridge troll kind of like troll guy. Like I don't know how else to. He's a troll.
He's a troll
guy. But I mean, and he's kind of creepy, and he wears like the pedophile jacket that they always wear in like Lovely Bones. Like you know what I'm talking about. And
yeah, like a troll would do.
But there's. Shut up. But there's that moment where he's like, I'm going to go get some donuts. And then he sort of looks at her and he's like, you know, I'm going to wait for you. And I thought that like that little tiny, because of how consistent he is, that little tiny bit of like character development for him, that change in what his decision was going to be was all the more like fulfilling for me as a viewer. Cause I was like, oh, he's real.
Yeah.
Right.
I loved when he curled up in the fetal position at the party and was listening to Magic Moments like that. I really, really enjoyed. So it's not that I didn't think that like this show was fun because that was what overwhelmingly that was what was so great about it. It was like the wrestling montage moments, or when they finally figured out a storyline, or when they start acting out this like, you know, dynamic rivalry between Russia and USA, and it's kitschy and it's terrible. I did feel like that gave you a little bit of insight into the into that experience, into kind of these flat good versus evil, you know, good triumphs moments that wrestling has in it. I just didn't know that like it's not a show that I think, unfortunately, that can compete. And so we'll have to see what happens like as the show progresses to see if it can kind of make more of itself.
Yeah.
You know,
It's worth noting that it's been renewed for a season 2 already, which is impressive because Netflix has gone on kind of like a machete wielding murder spree with a lot of its original series.
That's true.
I mean, just the ones that don't get views, like Sense8. If you wanted it so much, you should have watched it. Anyway, I'd like to circle back a little bit because I want to talk. I think Ruth and Debbie and Sam are all interesting, wonderful main characters, but I want to talk a little bit about the side characters because I think they have some fascinating arcs. So we talked about Sheila the She-Wolf a little bit, and it was interesting. I was a little weirded out in that it was like positive representation of what I learned is called otherkin, which we think about people who are like, I think I'm a wolf or I think I'm a dog, and we think, well, that person's crazy, right? We don't think of it in terms of like someone who has a trans identity who it's like, no, that's perfectly valid. And I think it was interesting because it talked about, cool, this is someone whose identity you might not be comfortable with or you might not accept, but they're a person and they have feelings and they're interesting, and accepting their identity as much or as little as you agree with it is really meaningful to them. And I thought it was fascinating and something it made me think. It made me stop and think.
Well, and it'll be interesting to see how that representation ages over time, because there were parts of this show, the way that they participated in, particularly like having them watching her put the nail polish on her teeth during that one sequence when she's doing her makeup, like, was uncomfortable. And so I wonder how some of these things will age over time, and if we'll have a more accepting perspective of them after a while. You know, is this a really good representation of this kind of experience, or is this one of just the first ones we've seen, and so we sort of go, oh, that's different, and so we're talking about it that way.
Well, and I thought a particularly interesting thing that the show does is that, we've got a lot of multi-ethnic representation in the show, but I think that I really enjoyed seeing that, and I think it's grossly overdue. But then the show sort of does this reductive thing where we boil them down to stereotypes, and they're not even accurate stereotypes, right? So the Indian girl, they call her Beirut.
Yeah, Artie.
And she's just like, yeah, that's not what I am. And he's like, but that's what you look like.
Yeah, it's like Arab terrorist. I'm Indian. Like, different
Right.
group of people.
Well, and I thought that was particularly terrifying in those moments, towards the end of the show where she's actually experiencing a true racist reaction to people that are in the crowd. And that was so hard to watch her have to deal with that. And then to have her brush it off backstage. And just sort of accept that as her new reality was pretty heartbreaking to me.
And I think that's brilliant, right? Because so many shows would give us some vindicated moment where all the girls stand up and say, you're being racist. But it's like, no, that happened in wrestling. That's the point. That was, you're a stereotype, and we're going to play on the hatred of these groups of people. We have this hostage situation. Everyone's mad at these terrorists in Beirut, right? And so we're going to capitalize on that. And the fact that they just make her deal with that is not only, I think, brave, but it's authentic. That you kind of, especially in the 80s, you kind of just have to deal with it. Because what are you going to do?
Yeah. Well, and then you've got, Sidel Noel, who plays Cherry Bang. She's the black woman who she's supposed to be the star of this thing. That's how she's sold on this idea. And then ultimately, the rug gets pulled out from under her, and she's barely even wrestling. She's just sort of in the background, and she's, there's a large conversation about, blackness. Is there a space for it in 80s television? And sort of the overwhelming answer is, well, if you become the stereotype, right? Because you've got Welfare Queen, played by Kia Stevens, and she's sort of embracing this hyper stereotype of black people as leeching off of the system, and what exactly does that mean, and how does she play that up? And there's a whole back and forth between her and Sam of whether or not this is okay. She's like, my kids are going to see this. Is this an okay thing for me to be doing?
Right, and he's only interested, it's a statement, man. I don't care. It's a statement. I'm gonna push against the system.
Well, that was one of the reasons I deeply identified with Sam, was that he has this sort of pseudo-intellectualism about him that is sort of trying to destabilize all of these stereotypes. I loved the section where he's monologuing about his new film that ends up being Back to the Future.
Mothers and Lovers.
Yeah, and it was the greatest. I thought that was so pitiful and so sad. But at the same time, he's smart enough to know how limited he is, and yet he's still trying to make it. And so it was so again, that role, that male role, I was so conflicted over it, and when he's having this conversation where he's telling her what she's going to be. And we have to look at him and go yeah, but the show kind of frames him as likable. So what are we supposed to do with that in terms of the feminism, right? That whole sequence is kind of funny and humorous. And so I end up liking him at the end of the show. And should I really be doing that when he is so nefarious? And perhaps that's the statement that they're actually trying to make about gender equality, is that we like each other. I don't know. It was really frustrating for me.
Well, and that he and Bash come to some weird agreement with each other, right? There's a lot of moments where they're sort of going back and forth. And he's like, yeah, I totally see your vision. I see what you're trying. He's like, yeah, I see what you're trying to do. And it's just this back and forth circle jerk between these two guys over how amazing the other one is.
Hey, doing coke in a hotel over a weekend's a real bonding experience.
Yeah,
Do not undersell that.
It's just, I think you're right. There is a really nefarious element to all of this, but I think that's a really interesting conversation that's happening, especially because they're nefarious, but they're also so vapid and uninteresting a lot of times, right? They're so just stereotypically masculine because we have these multifaceted women who are being forced into these stereotype roles, and then we have these literally stereotyped men who are trying to be sold as multifaceted when they're just not.
Yeah.
Well, and I wondered too, it was interesting to me, the comparison that they make throughout the show that's very clear that basically wrestling is just a soap opera for men.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
that's essentially what they're doing. And I wonder what a true wrestling fan would feel about that kind of characterization, and or if the way that they depict wrestling in these shows is actually accurate, you know, or if they're playing to these sort of stereotypical and problematic and sort of stupid visions of wrestling.
So I think if you characterize it as a soap opera, they'd say, nah, I'm not into that. But if you said, what are the things you like about wrestling? They'd be like, it's dramatic. They've got elements. They do great fights. Like, they would say things that you'd go, cool, you're describing a soap opera, right? Because
Right.
that's what sets it apart. That's why it's a popular sport, even though everyone knows and acknowledges it's fake.
Well, and I know that there's a really interesting movement in the academic community where they've talked about like WWE and sort of the power struggles and tracking that as a way to understand cultural experience, the roles of women over time, and looking at feminism from. And so I had heard a little bit from the academic community that this didn't quite represent wrestling in the ways that they had hoped. But I also think that there were some really deeply satisfying moments that were super playful. I even really enjoyed the script that went on for like 3 hours in one of the early
I can't
episodes.
say the name, but the name in the script that Alison Brie's character plays
Yes.
is the greatest name ever made.
Yes, it is. And so, or I thought it was also very funny. So there were so many interesting choices like that, that parodied the genre, like the wrestling in and of itself, but also really emphasized some of its charm. And I thought that was great.
So, final thoughts. What's the grade?
For me, I'm gonna give this one like a B+. I think that the characterization is really strong. I didn't feel like I really enjoyed the costuming and some of the style of the show, but I didn't think like the production was something I hadn't seen before or was super excited about. I thought the dialogue was great and very humorous, and it was one of the funniest shows that I laughed out loud at that I've seen recently. And so I really enjoyed some of those elements. I really enjoyed Alison Brie. I thought she did a really good job in this, and I'm excited to watch her character in the next season.
So I know it sounded like we were at odds a lot during this conversation, but I'm going to give it a B+. And so I think it's because the show does enough interesting stuff for me to have enjoyed watching it and to be looking forward to the season 2 that we're getting. I do think that it needs to do a little bit, if it wants to start making the kinds of big, broad, thematic, socio-political statements that it seems like it's trying to make, I think it needs to change some things narratively in order to really sort of hit those points home. So my fingers are crossed. I'm cautiously optimistic about season 2, and I think you're right. Alison Brie was outstanding, and especially as a departure from Community, this was outstanding on her part.
Yep.
Yeah. So I'm going to give it a weak A, since it's almost
Is that an A minus?
No, it's almost an A minus. It's like on the grading scale, it's like 93.5%.
Oh.
So, because I honestly like, I didn't find a lot of the criticisms you guys had. I agree with them. But I think it's hilarious, it's thoughtful, it shines a light on a realm that I didn't think about or know about. It handles stereotypes and women's oppression in a way that I think is fresh and interesting, in that we try to box women and feminism and what's feminist in a certain way. But you know what? Sometimes being the bad guy and taking a job that gets objectifies you, but you can do really well, and taking empowerment from that can be feminist. And I think it sort of raises some questions and expands our thoughts a little bit. So I think it's a solid A. I'm super excited for season 2.
Cool. So what are you guys watching this week then?
I am watching Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's my fave. I love that show. It's a story about a brother and a sister who discover an avatar who's the master of all 4 elements trapped in an iceberg. And it's about their journey for him to learn all 4 of the elements: earth, fire, water, air. And I did it in the wrong order, but that's all right. So it's this really epic story. It's this epic journey of these people trying to understand friendship and growing up in a really difficult situation. And it's one of my absolute like favorite television shows. I think it's so excellently paced from the first season all the way to the end. And it's a show for like 11, 12, 13-year-olds, but I have enjoyed it like so many different times. Uncle Iroh is just the best character he's my very favorite person in the entire world. So that's been a show that I've been revisiting this week, and all you Avatar fans out there, man, it's the best.
What about you, Ashley?
So
Not the movie. Also.
only the movie.
No!
So I've been watching season 3 of Difficult People. It's this amazing show on Hulu, and it stars Billy Eichner and Julie Klausner, and it's on season 3, but it's basically, if you've seen It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which is about a group of people who are just the worst people in the world living together and living their life in a bar, this is sort of like a better version of that, where it's just these two terrible people who revel in each other's terribleness, but there's no self-awareness about how awful they are. They just go about their daily lives being awful. And I know that sounds like a really weird premise for a show, but it's doing some really fascinating things about, like, class warfare. It has conversations about race, about transgender identity, about LGBT identity, about, like, all of these. There's so much stuff happening in this show that is so beautiful that I cannot recommend it enough. So go to Hulu, watch all 3 seasons. It's definitely worth your time.
So I'm watching the 2nd season of My Hero Academia, which is from Studio Bones, which is a great anime studio.
Oh, now I'm out.
Yeah, no. I'm going to hit you with that weeboo stuff right now. Otaku all the way. No waifu, no laifu. So anyway, so My Hero Academia is great. It's basically in the world, most people are born with a superpower, or they call it a quirk. And so basically the economy's become everyone's a hero, and they're all sort of competing to be heroes. And it's about a kid who's born without a quirk, but all he wants in the world is to be a hero like his idol, the greatest hero. And it's about him sort of inheriting power and striving to be a hero and go to school to do that. And what's valuable about it, what's amazing, is it makes me feel like I'm reading a 1950s hero comic, because it's this pure examination of being a hero is about meddling when you shouldn't. It's about self-sacrifice. It's about what's in your heart. It's not about what you can do. And it's just great. And if you don't like anime, watch it. And if you do like anime, you've already watched it, because obviously you're smart.
Thank you for joining us for this discussion of G.L.O. on UniversiTV. Next time, we're going to be having a conversation about the original Twin Peaks series.
Go do your homework.
I'm Jessica K. Richards.
I'm Ashley Zanter.
And I'm Scott Nielsen.
And this is UniversiTV. Class dismissed. Make sure to check us out on Facebook or Twitter by liking us at UniversiTV Podcast, or you can email us at universitytvpodcast@gmail.com with your recommendations for future episodes.